20 years after 9/11, I'm filled with a feeling of sadness, a sadness that is driven not just by memory, but also by a conscious awareness of how things look now and how little has been accomplished over this period of 2 decades. One way to think about it is imagine the plight of a woman who survived the collapse of the Twin Towers, who survived 9/11, whose son grew up to want to fight against the radical Muslims, to fight for America, went off to Afghanistan, was wounded or was killed. What do you think that family is feeling now as they survey this disaster, the embarrassing U.S. pullout, the stranded Americans still in Afghanistan, the fact that we have given the Taliban an air force, basically equipped, we've become ourselves, perhaps intentionally, a state sponsor of terror. And the radical Muslims are stronger than ever. All those arms will end up on the world market, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Iran. So all of this has happened, making them stronger. And meanwhile, our country seems more confused, more divided. We've introduced in America a massive surveillance state, but to what end? A lot of this seemed well-intentioned at the beginning, and many of us, supported it. We thought, wow, if there are some radical Islamists among us, and we need to have surveillance to kind of fish them out, it's justified. And then it'll stop. But we've now realized, and this is a dismaying realization, that first of all, even the effort to go after those guys had a very sleazy element to it. Some of these plots were cooked up by the FBI. They would put these people up to it. Hey, Rashid, yes, go join ISIS. Then they bust the plot. Wow, we're amazing. Look what we did. Also, the way in which the Patriot Act renewed again and again and again, the way in which the surveillance state there's no end in sight. Even to this day, it doesn't look like any of these practices are going to be lifted and normalcy restored. And this is a very sobering lesson for us who believe in freedom, that when we allow the desire for safety, we're seeing it right now with the vaccine mandates, when we allow the desire for safety to trample on our liberties, we always think, oh wow, this is going to be short-lived, but it never is short-lived. And you end up afterward less safe and also less free. I want to talk in this segment briefly about the deformity, the toxicity of radical Islamic culture. And then in the next segment, I'm going to talk about the toxicity of liberal or progressive culture in the United States. Around 2006, I published a book talking about this phenomenon, the fact that you may say radical Islam and radical leftism, which appear to be two completely disconnected phenomena, nevertheless operate together. They operate together like the two sides of a scissors. Now, let's start by talking about radical Islam, because although bin Laden is dead, his legacy tragically lives on. Bin Laden's dream, if you can call it that, was to inflict a mortal blow on America, a blow that America would never forget. He wanted to dispel the myth of American invincibility. This is almost a quotation right out of the bin Laden papers. By the way, a whole trove of bin Laden papers were fished out of Abbottabad in Pakistan after the bin Laden operation involving Robert O'Neill. So bin Laden's goal was to strike at what he called the Great Satan, America, the head of the snake. And they did. But I think that their broader success is not merely the fact that the operation itself was carried out almost without flaw, but the fact that 20 years later they can look around and say, listen, we got Afghanistan back, so we've in a sense thwarted the U.S. attack. Iran is very close, if it isn't already there, in getting a nuclear weapon. the radical Muslim states continue to be a global menace. In fact, now they have the opportunity, and we see this in places like Venezuela, where the radical Muslims are able to ally with Chinese and with Russians and even with radical leftists in Venezuela. And here we see in America, look at the recognition, for example, given to radical Muslims like Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar. These people were at one time so far on the margin of American politics that none of us knew their names. Now they're in Congress. So we have a radical Islamic element inside of America that is working in conjunction with, if not in cahoots with, radical Islamic elements abroad. So the war on terror, if we were to do a little bit of a balance sheet 20 years later, it's a very bad balance sheet. Yes, we have not had massive terrorist attacks on America since 9/11. So that, I suppose, would be on the positive side. I mentioned yesterday there are Afghan girls who've grown up for 20 years without the Taliban. They've been able to go to school. So there have been these kinds of modest gains. But when you set them against the fact that here the most powerful country in the world undertakes an expedition to defeat these radical Muslims who are trying to revive, think about it, a kind of 7th century Islamic caliphate. This is their goal. You would think that this is a goal that the whole world laughs at, rejects completely. It has no support outside of modest pockets of the Islamic world. We should have been able to defeat it militarily, politically, ideologically, and yet it seems that we have, in a sense, suffered major reversals on all these fronts and even lost the appetite to continue the fight at the end of it. American attention is now turned inward. And in some senses, I think that's okay. That's appropriate. It's a measure of the deep problems we have at home. And what I want to talk about in the next segment is about how today we have less to fear from the enemy abroad than we do from the enemy at home.